Hey friends, this is Ellie Holcomb, and I'm so excited to invite you to join me and the Lifeway Women for an Advent Bible study, Joy to the World. I'll be leading you in song each week, and my friends at Lifeway Women have created video devotional content, personal study in the Bible study book, family devotions, Advent activities, and more. We can't wait to celebrate the good news of great joy found in the Christmas story with you this Advent season through this new study. Learn more at lifeway.com/joy to the world.
This is the Marked Podcast from Lifeway Women. Each episode, we'll talk about what God is doing, how He has and is marking each of us. We're so glad you've joined us today. Hello and welcome to the Mark Podcast. I am Elizabeth Heineman, and I am joined today by my teammate at Lifeway. You've heard her on the podcast before, Ashley Gorman. Hello, Ashley.
Hi.
She is co-hosting this episode with me because she edited the book Political Gospel by Patrick Schreiner, and we are very excited to have Patrick on today. So welcome.
Thanks for having me. It'll be fun talking to you about politics.
Yes, we're all looking forward to it. Everyone in this room. Before we get into all of that, if you'll just tell us about yourself and your family and your ministry.
Yeah, so I live in Kansas City with my family, married to Hannah. We have 4 children, and they're in middle school and elementary school, so they're all gone. And thankfully, this podcast is occurring before they come home, so they won't bust in here and interrupt us. But they're wonderful. We love living here in Kansas City. We moved here in 2020. We were in Portland, Oregon before that, and I teach at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary here in Kansas City, just right down the road, which is one of our Southern Baptist schools. It's our newest one, but we've been growing a lot as a school and hiring, and it's a really exciting time to be at Midwestern. And so very happy to be here, very happy that the Chiefs won last night, their first game, and rooting for a three-peat. So I've definitely become a Chiefs fan while I've been here in Kansas City.
I feel like you have to.
It's so fun. I'm a Vikings fan. Yeah. I don't want to talk sports, but that's a terrible existence. So being a Chiefs fan is fun.
Okay, I was a Gamecock fan for much of my life.
Yeah.
And it was really painful existence. So
I'm a Vanderbilt fan if we're talking like college. So
yes,
I understand.
You understand the suffering. But it's not it's not suffering for the Chiefs. But it's hard to go to games because they're so good and it's so expensive. But Kansas City is a great place to be. You can kind of get a bunch of different places, west, east, very quickly. And so we're really loving being here.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I mentioned that you wrote a book a couple of years ago called Political Gospel, Public Witness in a Politically Crazy World. And I feel like that's even more needed this year. We feel that acutely. So tell us about the book and what you were hoping readers come away with after reading it.
Yeah, maybe I can tell you a little bit of the story behind the book. I generally publish in New Testament studies. I teach the Bible in Greek. And, as I was going through different parts of the New Testament, just the Bible in general, as everything was happening in the political scene from 2016, 2020, kind of from, Donald Trump to COVID to everything that's kind of happened, I was just trying to think like, how can we help the church think through these things well and really think through these things biblically? I didn't do political science as a degree. I study the scriptures, but as I enter into churches and I go and speak at churches, what people really want to hear from is what God's word has to say to them about every facet of their lives. And as I thought about it, certainly there's certain texts that we like to go to, like Romans 13, submit to governing authorities, Acts 5, don't obey governing authorities. And you have these kind of two poles. And it kind of depends on who's in power, which one you want to go to. But as I began to study the New Testament and think about it more, and even the Old Testament, I became more convinced that we need to go back to the scriptures because this separation between religion and politics really didn't exist in the same way that it does now in Jesus's day and Paul's day. And so I started to realize that Jesus and Paul and Peter and the rest of the apostles, really, they were political figures in their day. That's how people understood them. And especially Jesus being crucified as the King of the Jews is the most obvious example. And so often we come to the Bible and we view these people as religious figures. And we do have that separation between religion and politics. And so we view Jesus as kind of bringing this religious message about our hearts, which is true. And I never want to deny that. And I don't deny that. But certainly in the first century, he's so much more than that. And that as you see him go around and preach, and Paul preach, and these different followers of Jesus, you see that it actually causes some political turmoil, and it causes political questions. And so stepping back, I realized there's so much more in the Bible about how we should engage in politics than just those simple Romans 13 and Acts 5, that really every facet of Jesus's life, every facet of Paul's life had these political implications. So we need to go to more narratives and think about them. And so for me, it was trying to enter into this conversation of politics and say, what does the scriptures have for us here? What does God's word have for us here? And really draw people back to the Bible. And it'll challenge us in some ways. It'll affirm what we're doing in other ways. But it's always good to go back to the foundation and see what God has said to us. And I truly believe the scriptures are timeless. Yes, they were written to a particular context, but they also speak to us as God's covenant people. And so it's really there to be a help to us. And so really that was my goal, to bring the scriptures to bear upon these political conversations.
Yeah. I think that's super helpful. And it is something that, especially as we're going into another election season, that we're all kind of thinking about. And we know examples where it has not been, it's been more on the politically crazy side than the biblical side. And so it's helpful to get that biblical framework. And I've been thinking about this a lot as we've been planning and executing an ethics class for Lifeway Women Academy. And that's what I do here at Lifeway. And so we've been thinking through, like, ethics is essentially how we are to live. And so all these things that as we live out the Christian faith, like, that's an example of ethics. And I don't think everybody thinks about that. They don't think about how politics could be biblical. And so I think to almost say, hey, this is a separation that we don't see in the Bible is going to be radical news for a lot of people that are listening, because they think of it as like, oh, these are very separate things. And so, yeah, I appreciate that. That was very helpful description.
And maybe even to follow up on that, when people hear me say, well, Jesus was a political figure and Paul was, a lot of times you hear, like, in the church, we'll get politics out of the church. And I understand what they mean by that, in terms of, like, let's focus on what we need to focus on and not on politics. But part of it is redefining what politics is.
What do you think people mean when they say the word politics? And what is your book saying? What do you think the true definition is?
Yeah, I think when we hear politics, probably as Americans, we hear of partisanship, of two parties, like, get politics out of the church. When we hear that, it's like, well, don't become, so partisan in terms of who you're advocating for in the church. And some churches might say, no, we should be more partisan. But you also hear you hear things from various leaders in terms of what to do. When I refer to politics, I just simply mean the activities associated with the organization of a people. And so politics comes from the Greek word, actually, polis, which just means city. So how do you organize a people group? How do you organize people who live near one another in terms of how they interact with one another? And so really it's just about the organization of a people. And in that sense, I actually want to kind of push back against, let's stop talking about politics. Let's just start talking about the gospel. I understand, again, what people mean by that, but I want to draw back that conversation and say, actually, we need to recover kind of the historic sense of the word politics and political, and understand that Jesus was truly a political figure. And what that means is that most Christians aren't nearly political enough. In other words, the way to combat either total apathy about politics, like secular politics, American politics, or complete like buying into everything that's happening and getting way too into it and just being consumed by what's happening in American politics, is to actually recover the political nature of Jesus' message. So it almost sounds contradictory. Like, how do you become less political in terms of your views of what's going on in the world? Well, the way to do that is actually to recover the political nature of our faith and to remind ourselves Jesus has actually taught us the true politic. He's actually told us he is the King of Kings. And then we let kind of everything else fall under that. And then we can begin to think about politics and how we should engage and how we should interact and how it's important, but not ultimate, and how we can certainly vote and we can engage in these things, but it doesn't have to be our whole life and our identity marker and things like that. And so I wanted to kind of bring us back to what politics is in the historical sense and say, yes, Jesus was a political figure, and he's going to return as a political figure and reign and rule as a political figure as our king. And that should really put politics in its place.
Hi, friends. I'm Jennifer Rothschild, and I want to invite you to join me for the Prepare Him Room virtual event this Christmas season. This time is going to be filled with worship led by Michael O'Brien, plus encouragement and teaching that is going to draw your heart to Jesus. So whether you're watching on your own or with a small group or hosting the event at your church, I know that you will discover the joy of Jesus' birth all over again. Register today at lifeway.com/preparehimroom. That's lifeway.com/preparehimroom.
Yeah, I love that in the book when, going through it. I mean, this book came out a couple years ago, but the truth of it still just stands so timelessly just because the Bible does,
Yeah.
But one of the things I really enjoyed is the direction it pointed me in as I was walking through it. It wasn't right here, right now, who to vote for. That's not like the
Yes.
goal of the book. It's you come out and say that in the intro. You say, I'm not this book is not telling you who to vote for in this moment. It's actually casting your eyes forward to the fact that the Christian story is on this trajectory, and the trajectory is the Lord reigning and ruling, and that is a political reality where we will be subjects in a He's bringing the kingdom of God. It doesn't say, the country club of God. It says the kingdom of God, right? And so that's a political word. So what do we do with that, right? And I love this one. I wanted to read this one section. I don't want to give away the farm, right? Because the rest of the book is so good. I think this one, like maybe it's a paragraph or two, gets at what you said. And I think it's such a good, I don't know, what's the appetite to get through the rest of the book? But you say, my argument in this book is that Christianity is political. Though it might sound crazy in our supercharged political climate, I don't think the average Christian is nearly political enough, which is what you just said. It has become a truism to state that Jesus didn't come with a political message. As the trope goes, though Israel expected a warrior king to come riding on a horse to overthrow Rome, he actually came with a spiritual message about their hearts. Jesus simply wants a relationship with you. The problem with that is that it's a half-truth. Jesus made a political announcement. He declared himself to be king. We have one ruler to whom we are loyal. And you talk about a popular song that came out, I think, Jesus is King, and you say, many still think Jesus is King means he's Lord of my life. We forget Jesus is more than that. He is the King of kings. He wasn't conservative or progressive, but we can't miss the politics of Jesus. The whole biblical storyline can be put under the banner of politics in these terms. 1, God put humans here to rule the earth. 2, sin is insurrection. 3, redemption is the offer of amnesty and the citizenship in a new kingdom. And 4, restoration is an empire that's coming. And to me, that was so clarifying and a way to communicate, like, look at all these political dimensions of just the gospel message itself and the identity of Christ.
Right.
Because we're really interested in like the work of Christ, but the identity of Christ matters too. And part of his work is establishing a kingdom. That was really clarifying and helpful for me because it pushed me past, Jesus is red or blue, donkey or elephant, and more. No, what does the Bible say? who he is and his identity as king, and what is the trajectory we're on as the people of God, and how do we live that out today in various different styles of government across the world. But in America, it's going to look a certain way. So anyway, that was really helpful to me. I hope it's helpful for anyone listening to get at what, Patrick, you're talking about in your book. And one thing is, like, that's a beautiful picture looking forward, but there's a lot going on right now in our current moment. And so I'm wondering, like, what do you think is the most disturbing facet of our political climate right now?
Yeah, where do I begin? No. Yeah, I mean, most disturbing facet. I think we could, in one way, I could begin and say, we have a lot to be thankful for. If you travel, if you know places that don't have a well-functioning government where the power goes out all the time, although the power still goes out in my house sometimes, or the internet is not working, or the roads, you can't even travel, or there's no lights, or you get robbed along the way, there's no police force. I think it is easy, especially for young people. I guess I think I'm young still. For young people to take for granted, like, all of the benefits that we have in this nation. And so I just want to begin even by saying, like, we have so much to be thankful for. And the fact that we can have this conversation and not have, like, this recording shut down, you know what I mean, is a blessing. It really is. Through history, like, you think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer during World War II, and he's denouncing Hitler, and the radio program shuts down. You know what I mean? Like, he's fired. He cannot lecture anymore. And so, there's so many different forms of government that have been oppressive, totalitarian. And so we do have a lot to be thankful for. At the same time, the reason I wrote this book is because I was concerned, both at the larger, I'd say, kind of secular level, and then in the church, that politics has become a new religion. And it's become a new identity marker for people. So in other words, as Christianity has kind of waned in the West, it's the rise of politics seems to have gained momentum, so that people are now identifying themselves with a party so much, disagreeing with, like, the core of who I am. And that's where I get nervous, because I'm like, wait, I'm totally fine with people using partisanship as a tool to do good. So if you feel like you need to vote a certain way, and because that's going to be better for society, I'm all for that. But when it becomes core to your identity, I think that's when it gets dangerous, when you can't, like, disagree well with one another, and you are hating people who disagree with you. And even we've seen in larger society violence break out. We've seen in the church, I'd say we've seen in the church people leave churches over these things. And again, every situation is different. I don't want to be too quick to cast judgment. But at the same time, it concerns me that maybe you've had relationships for so many years, and then political things came to the forefront, and people are like, well, I can't be friends with you anymore because of that. That's, I think, one of the big concerns for me. And so, man, politics is super important. I don't want to lessen it, because, there's a lot of people who are suffering or not suffering because of politics. And as Christians, we should care about that, because we are called to love our neighbor. We are called to do good to all people. And so I don't want to just, like, cast politics aside, but you also don't want to make it something more than it is. And Jesus, when Jesus is asked, should we pay taxes to Caesar? There's a sense in which I don't know his tone. The Bible doesn't, Mark 12 doesn't tell us his tone, but there's a sense in which I feel like he kind of shrugs at the question. And I don't know that he actually shrugged, but that he kind of is like, pay taxes to Caesar and give to God what is God's. In other words, like, you're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. It feels like he takes the most politically charged question of the day and basically takes the air out of the balloon a little bit, right? And everyone walks away like, what? And I think we need to do that more. I think we need to follow Jesus and just take the air out of the room a little bit, and just lower the heat on some of these conversations. And so, that concerns me. And then, like, inflation. No, I'm just kidding. Inflation concerns me. I have 4 kids to feed. So if you want to get real practical.
We're like, the grocery bill really, really is just,
that one's the funny one.
Sure.
No, we could get more granular than that. But I think we have a lot to be thankful for. And we can also recognize that partisanship or politics shouldn't be an identity marker, especially for Christians,
Right.
Yeah, that is where I see the most damage being done. Is it moves from this is a tool I use in the world to do good, like common good, and showing up to the public square is a way to help the common good for sure. But there's a difference in that, and this is who I am.
Right.
And there's like a loss of, I think you said, like, as religion has pulled away, there's almost been like this void, and it has like politics has been a way that we can sometimes supplant religion. Even people that think I'm not religious, and for them the void is there, an identity hole is still there. So who am I if I'm not going to be religious? And I think it's politics has really filled that void in a lot of ways. It's become a religion to people. At least it's functioning like
That's
one.
right.
Yeah.
And people are identifying in the way they would a religion. And so that to me is the place where it really breaks my heart to see Christians walking in that, because we have this eternal identity that is not tethered to temporary rise and fall of a governmental system or certain leader or something like that. There's a way you can honor the King of Kings right where you are and point to his future reign, you know, and his current reign, because he ascended. You also wrote about a book about that. So he ascended. Yeah, he's reigning right now. But anyway, so I just really, really relate to that.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about a book that I think both of us have read. It's not a Christian book. It's called Cultish. And I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head, but it is a book about the language of cults. But one of the things that she does, and it was fascinating to read this from a non-believer, but she talked about how we're all looking for identity, we're all looking for purpose, and we're all looking for community. And she was like, it's almost like we were created that way. And I was like, we were. But she talks about this and how, like, so all these different organizations, and she's looking at it from the perspective of a cult, but she's like, all these different organizations use language that promises a fulfillment of those things that we all desire. And so she talks about things that aren't cults, but use cultish language, because they're talking about your identity, they're talking about your purpose in life, and they're talking about community. And so she talks about like gyms and things like that, where it's like, you belong here, and this is your purpose, and let's all come together, and this is who you are. And I think when you were talking about politics becoming an identity, I think that those three things, for a lot of people who have left the church maybe, or who have never been a part of the church, they're looking for those things. And politics promises those, but doesn't actually fulfill them in the same way that Christ does, obviously. And so I think that was just what was coming to my mind as you were talking about that, is people are seeing it from, secular perspectives as well, that this is something that's happening. And I think that's part of the reason why we've seen this rise in identifying with that when religion is on the decline. And so, because people are looking for those things, and that's where they. And
sometimes people, as I've done different interviews and I've gone to different churches to speak on this topic, because we're in an election cycle and people want to think about it, which I'm so thankful for. But often, the question after my sessions is like, how do I get more engaged with politics? And which I think is like normal people working normal jobs, Christians just trying to be faithful, and they're like, hey, I want to get more engaged, but I don't like. It's young moms with kids or fathers who are just working 40 hours a week at a bank downtown. They're like, I don't know what this looks like for me to get more engaged. And, typically my advice, and maybe it's very milquetoast, but my advice has been the most political thing, if you understand what I'm arguing rightly, the most political thing you can do is join a local church. It's the most political thing, because as you were mentioning, like, we're all searching for kind of that community, that meaning in our life. And what the church is meant to do, it's meant to be your primary political identity. And actually, when I began thinking about other people have mentioned this as well, but every community is trying to form us in different ways, and rightly so. So like even our nation is trying to form us. So we have special holidays, right? Where we celebrate things. July 4th, my kids love it because we get to go set off fireworks. We have special songs that we sing, right? God Bless America. We have a document that's so important, the Constitution for Americans, right? And these are all forming us, and in many ways, good ways. But the church, if you actually just transfer some of those things over, and you have political speeches, right? And you sing songs and all these things, the church has those same things. And it's trying to form you in different ways. We have political speeches, I would say, on a type of Sunday morning, declaring Jesus is King, not that type of political speech. We sing songs. We have special holidays. Yeah. Sunday is our special holiday every week where we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. We have a document that we base our beliefs on, which is the scriptures, which have been handed down to us over generation. And so when people ask, like, what does it mean for me to get more involved, to be more political? I just want to start at the very simple level where everyone can engage. And it's like, go to church and love the people in your church and love your pastors and love your neighbor. And I think that is actually, that's exactly what Paul and Jesus did. Like, Paul planted churches and Rome was like furious at him, so mad at him for proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead, that he was on trial for many years of his life. He was sent to prison and he was eventually executed for planting churches. Like, it's like it seems like the most simple thing to us. But I think what Rome almost recognized was they recognized this is a counterculture. This is something different. And this is challenging our sovereignty.
Oh yeah, this is Jesus is King and not Caesar.
Right.
These people are identifying together under a different banner than like the banner of Caesar. And if they're not giving, it's like that feels threatening if you don't know what it is.
And so while it was a threat to them, it was also not a threat, because they're like, hey, we're not forming an army, says Jesus. Like, look at my disciples. They're not. Right. You shouldn't be scared of them. And Jesus can also say, my kingdom is not of this world in John 18. And so you've got to, my whole book is kind of trying to balance those two things of how it was a disruption to political society, but also that Christians were viewed and were supposed to be the most submissive citizens that Rome had ever seen, which is why all of Paul's judges look at him and they're like, yeah, I know everyone's really mad about this guy, but we really have nothing against him because he's done nothing wrong. Yeah. And that's the balance that I really want to push Christians to have, where the world looks at us and they're like, wait, you're not following the same cues as us. But at the same time, you're the best neighbor, the best citizen, the person that I want to live next to, even though what you say and what you do seems so out of step with what everybody else is doing. And I think that's just the picture that the first century presents us.
I agree. And I think that's such a helpful perspective to have as we look into American politics. But also, I wanted you to speak. We have a few listeners that do not live in the United States of America. So what would this conversation look like for them? How does this message speak across like country geographic lines? And you kind of talked a little bit about that, but will you unpack that a little bit more?
As Ashley mentioned earlier, my goal in this book is not to figure out all the ethical issues, whether it's immigration, abortion, or even who to vote for. This book is really giving foundational principles. And I can't escape being in America and thinking through American politics. Right. That's just who I am. But I do hope if these are derived from Scripture, the Scriptures, which I think they are, they actually transfer over into any culture. It might look slightly different. But the way, what I was just describing was, it seems that the Scriptures present this way of subversion and way of submission, and that those two kind of paradoxical realities are always at play in how we interact with governing authorities, whether those governing authorities are like wonderful or totally evil. Even if they're wonderful, they don't fully represent Christ's kingdom. And if they're evil, they still might be doing some good in society. Does that make sense? And so obviously we can think of the most extreme examples where like, well, they're not doing any good. But for the most part, many governments are still doing some good. And that's good. And we should continue to cheer them on for doing that. Actually, Paul is not afraid while he's killed by Caesar himself. He's not afraid to claim he's a Roman citizen, to use politics as a way to say, like, this is who I am. This is where I live. And I'm, in one way, I think he's very thankful for the Roman roads and the aqueduct system and that he's able to travel and there's not war breaking out right and left. And so I would say for any person, any Christian who's living under any governmental system, they should recognize, number one, that government doesn't represent as a Christian fully the kingdom that is to come, but also that they can be thankful and there can be a form of submission to that because God has instituted these rulers. Now, obviously, it gets super nuanced and complex when it's like, well, what if there's so much suffering in this nation, in this state, in this country that we should overthrow the government? Well, that's another conversation that you can have. But very clearly in the scriptures, I mean, I began with kind of saying we only think about Romans 13 and Acts 5, but it is helpful to go back there and say, submit and only submit up to this point. Because if it goes against God's command, you can't submit any longer, because ultimately your disobedience and obedience is obedience to the King of Kings, right? You obey because he says so, and you disobey because he says so. So it's ultimately obeying Jesus Christ. And he determines how we engage with any governmental system.
Even as you were talking about, like, you know, the Roman government in Paul's time was not a good government. Like we would all say, like those were some bad people in the leadership, but it provided the peace of Rome, provided the means for which the gospel could spread, you know? And so it is trying to kind of think of that as like, well, yes, there are some very bad things happening, and obviously that is not good and that is not of God, but we can look at it through that lens of the gospel and just say, what opportunities do we have here that we wouldn't have in another country in another time?
For sure.
Yeah.
And it's, I think one of the most beautiful things about Christianity is how transcultural it is. It can live under so many governmental systems. It really is remarkable when you compare it to other modes of thought or schools of thought or religions. Even it can cross any border, and it can be lived out under any ruler. And communities of Christians, you know, can't. It's wild how sticky in each one of the places. You know, it's finding balance is hard, no matter. It's why certain letters of the New Testament sound different and look different, and you know because they're living it out in different contexts, but the truths remain, and the principles are lived out in every
Christians have lived under totalitarian regimes, under communist regimes, under non-democratic republic. Now, I think there's better and worse forms of government, but Christians can't exist in any form of government because it's not our ultimate hope. And also Christians have been those who have said we should have a certain form of government where people are valued, where people have freedom, where people can make choices on their own. And that, in that sense, I mean, there's a huge debate, like how Christian is America. It is based on, I would argue, it's based on Christian values in terms of the Christian worldview has created a society where we can be thankful for the freedoms that we have. And that's based on a Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei, that everyone is created in the image of God and they have rights, like God-given rights. And that's like a Christian thing that has formed our society. And we should be very thankful for that. And every society that has lost that, it quickly descends into really madness. And nobody should want that.
Well, Patrick, this is the Marked podcast. So the question we ask each of our guests is, what is one thing that has marked you in your walk with Christ?
One thing that has marked me, I mean, the first thing I thought of was I've just been very privileged to be a part of really good churches and under really good leaders throughout my life. I know that's not true for everyone, but very godly men and women who have shown me how to walk with Christ. So in one sense, what has marked me the most is other faithful Christians. Other faithful Christians have been such an example to me, whether that's pastors, campus ministry leaders, parents, siblings, friends. I think a lot of my perseverance in the Christian life is based on the input and encouragement of others and prayers of others. And so what's really marked me is I can't imagine walking with Christ alone. Because he really didn't create us to walk with Christ alone. He created us to walk with him, with others. And I just think without others, I don't think I'd be walking with Christ anymore. And that's what the church and the community of Christ is meant to do. And it's been so encouraging because it's been male, female, old, young, same age, into the same things, not into the same things, but different people have encouraged me throughout my life. And I'm just so thankful for that.
Yeah, I'm thankful for that too, in my own life and in yours. And I think that's something that all of our listeners can take as both an encouragement that there are people in our churches that are speaking good words and are encouraging one another, and also as a challenge to be that person for those around you. And so we are very thankful that you were on the podcast today and that you talked about politics and all of those things, because I know it's on top of mind for all of our American listeners, especially. Thank you, Ashley, for being on and co-hosting with me and providing so many great insights as well. We will be back next week, listeners, and we'll talk to you then. Marked is a production of Lifeway Podcast, produced by Aaron Franklin. It's recorded at the Lifeway Podcast Studio in Brentwood, Tennessee, and engineered by Donnie Gordon with help from Nathan Howard. Edited by William Hall with art by Leanne Dans. And I'm your host, Elizabeth Heineman. Meet me back here next week. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can find us on social media at Lifeway Women. Today's show notes will be posted at lifewaywomen.com/marked. If you enjoy the show, leave us a review.
Hey, I'm Natalie Abbott.
And I'm Vera Schmitz, and we want to invite you to join us for our new Bible study, Dwell on These Things. Together, we'll spend 8 weeks walking through Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 9, and we'll learn a simple method for memorizing the entire passage as we go.
Memorizing God's Word allows us to call it to mind at the times when we need it the most, and we're so excited for you to walk through this study and get equipped for a lifetime of memorizing Scripture. Learn more at lifeway.com/dwell. That's lifeway.com/dwell.